Well, I think, Yvonne, the developments, let's go through them, really highlight Russia's human rights abuses in the midst of an invasion of Ukraine, which of course has killed tens of thousands of civilians. You could talk about the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny simply because he was an opposition figure and the Kremlin's role in his death. You can talk about the EU sanctions that were imposed yesterday over Russia's deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and also to Belarus. You could talk about the killing of a Ukrainian defector, probably by Russian state operatives in Spain, simply because he chose to take a helicopter across the front line. And then you could talk about the case that you're highlighting on ABC today, which is that yet another U.S. Russian national has been seized, is being used as a bargaining chip simply because she made a $50 donation to a charity which tries to provide assistance to Ukraine. In other words, I'm going to link this to the Ukraine war. Within Russia, there are no rules of the game that cannot be broken. Uh, Candidates who want to stand for Ukraine's presidential or Russia's presidential election can be thrown out on the whim of a court decision. Uh, but those rules of the game, of course, have long been suspended in Ukraine. And for all those activists who continue to defend the Kremlin, continue to defend Russia, this isn't NATO. This isn't the West that are committing these abuses in Russia and in Ukraine. This is Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin.
And Scott, what's your assessment now? Is either side winning the war? How significant was Russia's recent capture of the city of Avdiivka?
There's a really sort of narrow focus danger that we've got here with the headline of the moment, and that is that a lot of news outlets, hopefully not ABC, said, oh, well, Russia's taking Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. This is it. Ukraine is losing. Russia's on the ascendancy. There was no context given. Avdiivka is only the second town or city that the Russians seized since July of 2022. They could only take Avdiivka after they devastated it, losing, according to a Russian military blogger who was forced to delete the post, at least 16,000 personnel who were killed or severely wounded in 4 months. That's more than the number of Soviet troops killed in Afghanistan in 10 years. In exchange for this one battle on the front line, if you take the wider context of the war, Ukraine is hitting deep inside Russia and inside Russian occupied territory, hitting their warships, hitting their air bases, hitting their oil refineries. Ukraine has broken the Russian blockade on the Black Sea and is now exporting grain again. In other words, if you look just at Avdiivka and the front line, you're playing into a type of Russian information warfare because Vladimir Putin has failed to conquer Kyiv. He's failed to take Ukraine. He's failed to replace the Zelensky government. So his last play is to break international support for Ukraine by saying, oh, you're wasting your money. Sooner or later, we're going to defeat them anyway.
Militarily, how do both sides stack up 2 years into the fighting?
I mean, Russia has a significant advantage in artillery shells, which is what you saw in Avdiivka, which is what they're trying to establish in other parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, that with 5, 6, 7, even 10-to-1 advantage over Ukraine, and with a large advantage in manpower, they can eventually wear down Ukraine. Ukraine potentially, however, has a significant advantage in the way that it has mobilized its forces, the way that it has organized them. It has a significant advantage in armored equipment that has been provided by the West. It potentially has the arrival of U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets that could change the aerial dynamic. All of this turns upon the fact that militarily, will you continue to see assistance being given by places like Australia, by the European Union, and I think most importantly, by the United States? Or will you see people, for example, like Trumpist and hard-right Republicans in the U.S., effectively hold Ukraine hostage and possibly hand the initiative to Vladimir Putin because of their own narrow political ambitions?
Well, you mentioned Russia is trying to break that international support for Ukraine. What are the levels of aid that Ukraine is receiving right now compared to, say, a year ago, particularly from the EU?
I think the EU has been a story, and again, the press tends to miss it because they focus on the US, that in addition to a lot of the bilateral assistance that's being given, military, economic, financial, from almost all European countries, you had a breakthrough with the EU committing 50 billion euros through 2027 just a few weeks ago. They overcame the resistance of Vladimir Putin's ally, Hungary's Viktor Orban, to finally pass that through. You do continue to see countries in other areas of the world, such as Asia, continue to provide especially humanitarian and economic assistance, and you're getting assistance from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. The open question is whether this $60 billion of budget authorization from the Biden administration can finally get past Congress. It's been passed by the US Senate, but will the Trumpists and the hard right Republicans in the House continue to blockade it until you get to a point where Russia can, in fact, take an advantage on the front lines, however high the cost is to their own personnel?
Well, the US is today set to announce further sanctions on Russia over the death of Alexei Navalny, the 2-year war in Ukraine. Scott, do we know what these might likely be? He hasn't given any details, Joe Biden, but have such sanctions worked in the past in this conflict?
Well, I think what you're talking about, and we must be honest here, is there's a symbolic importance to sanctions here, and which is that, for example, the head and the 5 deputy heads of the prison where Alexei Navalny either died or was killed will be named, will be cited. That's sort of a signal to Russian officials, well, we know you're acting with impunity, and we're going to call you out on it. Now, in reality, will those officials ever have their assets frozen in the United States? Will they ever be subject to a travel ban? Probably not. The wider question here is will you get to the point where we have Russia's assets, the state assets abroad, which are about $300 billion, will they be seized in whole or in part by the US, by Europe, by countries like Japan? If they were, I think that would make a significant difference. But again, Yvonne, in terms of countering misinformation, disinformation, sanctions have had an effect on Russia. They haven't broken the Russian economy. That's not what they were aiming to do initially. They've limited Russia's capabilities to wage war. So once again, Vladimir Putin is going to have to try to use this information warfare to say those sanctions should be lifted, and inaccurately saying because they have no effect whatsoever.
And just lastly, conflict front lines may not shift for some time. Are we talking months or years before we could possibly see the end of this conflict?
I'll put this in terms of 2 contexts. If you look at Ukraine itself, you are talking about a fact where there may be very little change in terms of the balance between Ukrainian territory and Russian occupied territory. It may take a significant investment behind Ukraine in terms of air power and advanced weapons on the ground to shift those front lines. The Russians are unlikely to shift them, however many personnel they throw in at this point. But there's a wider context here, which is, and I think people miss this, Ukraine is on its path to becoming part of the European Union. Those negotiations begin in June. Ukraine is on a path possibly to either be a member of NATO or to be much closer to NATO. And of course, we're seeing countries like Finland and soon Sweden that have become part of NATO. We've seen Asian allies who've been rejuvenated in terms of we're part of an international coalition. In other words, even if the Ukraine front lines do not change, the world is changing. And it is changing in a way which is that there still needs to be decency, order, and a respect for human life. And international alliances are important.
Scott, thanks for analysing that for us. Always great to have you on our show, as always. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank your viewers.